Hello, everyone. Welcome to the expert interview, where we dive into the pressing issue shaping our society today. I'm Miko Santos, and in this episode, we exploring the realms of youth political engagement in Australia, especially as we approach the upcoming federal election. Joining us today is Luke Dean, an associate lecturer at Monash University School of Social Science and a PhD candidate focusing on young people political participation, democracy, and representation. Luke's research is provide valuable insight into experience and challenges faced by young Australian aspiring to political office, particularly at the local government level. Please welcome to the show the expert interview, associate lecturer Luke Dean. How are you today? Good afternoon.
Hi, Miko. How's it going? Very well. Thank you. Glad to be here with you today.
Thank you so much for your time, Luke. My prayer, you know, May 3rd is the upcoming
hmm
federal election. So there's a lot of both party are campaigning in every state right now. My first question to you is, how do you perceive the current state of political engagement among young Australian, particularly in the context of the upcoming federal election?
Yeah, absolutely. Super important question, and thanks for having me again. The engagement of young people in politics in Australia is a super important topic. Unfortunately, there is a level of disengagement with politics amongst young people, particularly around formal politics, around political parties, especially. Young people are, relatively disengaged from the formal political process, simply because there is a, lack of agency within the political system. So, young people are very engaged in political issues, whether it's, the ongoing housing crisis or, wealth inequality or climate change. There's a plethora of issues that young people are particularly engaged with and care about. Unfortunately, there is a disconnect between young people and political actors, because they certainly feel that they are politicians and especially the major political parties are either unable or unwilling to address their issues and their concerns and listen to their voices. So that can lead to a certain amount of disconnection from formal politics. So whilst young people are very engaged in issues that they care about, certainly within the formal political process there is a level of disengagement. So, with the election in mind coming up at the moment, young people are, generally pretty engaged and, pretty perceptive about the political issues that are being discussed. But there certainly is a level of disconnection, particularly from the two major parties when we're, looking at the upcoming election specifically.
That's interesting. Look, what factors do you believe contribute to the increasing political involvement of Gen Z and millennials who are projected to outnumber baby boomers in the electorate?
Yeah, so this is, the 2025 election will be the first time where, Gen Zs and millennials are, a larger proportion of the electorate than the baby boomer generation. So they have a significant amount of political capital, certainly, and young people certainly are making their political voices being heard. But there is a shift away from the major two parties. So you can see that in the first preference, the decline in the first preference vote for both the Labor and the Liberal Party, and the increase in young people's voting for minor candidates, independents, the Green Party, etc. So whilst young people have this incredible power within the political system, there is a widening gap between the two major parties and the wants, beliefs, needs, and preferences of young people as a whole.
Mm, that's very interesting. So I was looking in your research. Have you
Mhm.
identified specific issues that resonate more profoundly with young voters compared to the older demographic?
Yeah, certainly. Look, the the one of the misconceptions about young people is that they are particularly animated around a set of issues, and young voters are very much like any other voter demographic within the country. They are concerned about the cost of living crisis, they're concerned about housing affordability, they're concerned about ongoing issues around casualization of the workforce and work precarity, especially. Young people today are one of the most educated, most experienced group of generation, in Australian history, and yet they are facing, significant, work precarity, casualisation of the workforce, and issues around, economic issues around housing affordability, around being able to have a family, being able to own a home going forward. So these are certainly animating issues for young people, and your classic kind of ideas around climate change. The lack of climate change response by multiple governments over the last couple of decades has certainly led young people to be particularly animated about this issue. But the young people are not a homogenous group. They don't particularly have just one set of issues that they care about. Young people have a diversity of areas and issues that they really care about and are animated by. So whilst there are certain issues that we've kind of talked about previously, there is a broad diversity of experiences, preferences, wants, needs, and issues that they kind of care about within the community.
That's gonna be interesting on that. So how do you assess the say the effectiveness of political parties' strategies in addressing the concern and priorities of young voters?
Yeah, look, I think election cycle after election cycle, there are a number of platforms or policies to address significant issues within the community, but largely young people are forgotten. Young people. There are no, particular policies that are directly targeted to the experiences and the needs of young people, and you can see that within the current election or elections previously. So whilst there is some, certainly outreach in between elections, party youth wings are quite active, especially around university campuses. The young Labor, young Liberals, young Nationals are quite a significant force within the political recruitment kind of phase of young people's political engagement. The actual, issues or preferences, their needs are not really being addressed, and they're not being, spoken about, particularly during an election cycle as important as this one coming up.
You already talked earlier about social channels.
Mhm.
What do you think the role? What role do social media say social media influencer and digital platforms play in shaping the political opinions and engagement of young Australian?
Look, they're a significant, significant influence. The majority of young people these days do not watch linear television. They don't read newspapers. They are not engaged with media in this traditional kind of way. Social media has become the defining method or platform through which people both learn about political issues and actually engage with political issues. So, through collectivism, through consumer boycotts, through this kind of online activism, connecting with social issues. Social media has become a really prevalent way through which young people both engage and experience politics as a whole. So that means that they're quite influenced by what they see on social media, as any viewer is, obviously. But that can also lead to its challenges. Social media, especially these days, has become significantly more unregulated within election cycles in particular, especially over the last 12 to 18 months, with Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter, with the removal of moderation teams at Meta. Some of these platforms are taking a very hands-off approach around political speech, which has meant that there has been a significant increase in the amount of fake news and the amount of scare campaigns and the amount of disinformation that's really shared on these social media platforms. So whilst they're a particular benefit for young people to get involved and get engaged and to learn about political issues, there's also a danger there in the ways in which misinformation can be spread, and that can affect the ways in which young people either vote or perceive political issues or policies. Absolutely.
So, in relation with that misinformation,
Mhm.
disinformation, fake news, what you recommended uh, to to the government or any news organization about this? Do we need to do something so that young Australian will check and balance on this?
Yeah, look, I mean, I wouldn't go as far as to suggest that the government itself needs to regulate social media companies to, perhaps, deem what they can and can't say, or what can and can't be, produced on social media. But we certainly need to perhaps put more guardrails on the types of misinformation or disinformation that can occur, especially during an election cycle. We have, a very short election cycle compared to the rest of the world. It's only about 6 weeks long. So that, doesn't give us the ability to perhaps fact check and dive deeply into any of these political issues that might crop up, within a significant kind of time. So by, perhaps, having more moderation, or actually demanding that these, large multinational corporations, engage in moderation, particularly around election cycles, would be significant. But I certainly wouldn't want the government to, enforce, significant rules around what can and can't be said in political discourse.
Could you elaborate on the barriers that deter young people from participating in the political process, both as a voters and as a candidates?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the biggest barrier is certainly the culture around young people and their political engagement. The discourse around young people engaging in politics is often framed as a lack of civic accountability. Young people aren't voting as much as their older peers because they're somehow failing in this moral obligation to be an engaged voter. Whereas the reality is that government itself plays an important role in reaching out to young people and including them within the process. So there needs to be more done to engage young people, not just tokenistically, but through the platforms, means, and social media, etc. The ways in which they experience politics. Some of the other barriers that particularly face face young candidates are this expectation of, who can and should be a politician. Within society, we often, use these heuristics around experience, or, work experience, or having a long career, or having a family, and somehow suggest that these are the qualifications needed for a successful politician. When the reality is, what we're looking for is a good representative, somebody who is able to make difficult decisions and rely upon their own kind of compass and experience to engage with these issues. Young people often are perceived as, not having enough experience. A lot of the young candidates that I've interviewed have been asked questions like, "What life experience do you have? What have you done other than gotten a driver's license? Why should I vote for you because you're so young?" So we certainly need to change the culture around young people and their political engagement, and make it more acceptable for them to be a young politician. And unfortunately, these kind of influencers, or the expectations, are significantly enhanced for young women, especially, and young people from minority backgrounds, minority ethnic or linguistic backgrounds, because they don't match that expectation of the older, more experienced white male politician. Because they kind of break that mold, they face significant pushback within the community. So that's kind of the overarching issue that young people face. And the only other point to kind of raise before I let you speak again is, this idea of finances. Young people face a significant financial disconnect between, how much it costs to run for political office. It's quite an expensive process, not in terms of actually signing up, but in terms of, putting out flyers and advertising and all of that kind of stuff. And also, at the local level specifically, local councillors really aren't remunerated very much. Local councillors in, say, Victoria only get a stipend of about $20,000 a year. And young people simply can't afford to be a local councillor because that is not enough money for them to live on. So they can't give up their career to be a politician by running for local office, and therefore there isn't that pipeline of successful young politicians at the local level that could move up to the state or federal level later in time. So those are probably the key kind of issues that are facing young people and young candidates specifically.
How significant is the impact of compulsory voting in Australia on the political engagement levels of young citizens?
Oh, massive. Absolutely massive. So you can look at any of the research that is done around young people's political engagement. Compulsory voting is a, unaltered good. Compulsory voting ensures that young people are both engaged within the system and active within the system. So compulsory voting is certainly really important. If you look at the voting levels of young people, either in the UK perhaps or in the United States, generally they sit around the 40 to 50% mark of young people who actually go out and vote. Those people, say, under 30 years old. In Australia, 18 to 21-year-olds generally vote at a 71 or 72%. And then, once they hit 25, they're just as likely to vote as their older peers. So we're sitting around 90 to 95%. So you can see, at least a 20 to 30%, more increase in their likelihood of actually voting. So compulsory voting is, I think, a benefit to the Australian political system versus, a voluntary voting system.
Thank you for that, Luke. What are your thoughts on initiative like the Make It 16 campaign, which is advocate for lowering the voting age to 16?
Yeah, look, that's something I would certainly encourage, perhaps as a measure to ensure a greater kind of level of political engagement in young people's lives. I think it would be more likely to be successful, perhaps, if it was at the local level. It would be probably pretty difficult to get 16-year-olds to be able to vote at the federal level. There is some evidence internationally in Ireland, where Ireland and Scotland, I believe, where they've lowered the voting level from 18 to 16, and that actually increased the level of voting amongst those groups significantly within the next electoral cycle. So, it is a significant thing. It's something that I think would be, a benefit to our society. I'm just not certain that we'd be able to get it passed at the federal level, perhaps. It could be instituted at the local or state level, but I think, there are benefits there. The only caveat I would suggest is that, a colleague of mine, Zara Gazarian, did some research on young voters and their perception of this issue, and the majority of 18-year-olds themselves suggested that they didn't think that 16-year-olds should vote, that they didn't think they were, perhaps ready or experienced enough. So, there are two sides to this argument. Surprisingly, young people might or might not be in favour of this issue, but I think at least having that for the local level of government would be a benefit overall to Australian society.
Thank you for that. Have you observed any trends in party affiliation or support among young voters, particularly concerning minor parties or independents?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we discussed at the start of the interview, the first preference voting of young people, particularly for the two major parties, has been, sinking over the last 2 decades. It's currently at the lowest level amongst young people in, a long period of time. It's a little bit more acute amongst the Liberal and National parties. It is, a little bit less amongst the Labor. They're still getting some more support, but most of that kind of lowering of voting amongst those two groups has gone towards particularly minor parties, particularly the Greens. Young people are almost as likely to support the Greens now as they are the Labor Party, around 25 to 30% at a particular election. And some of that support has also gone to, independents as well. There is a little bit of a shift amongst young men, in particular, towards perhaps, some of the more culturally conservative kind of minor parties as well. But among young women, there's a little bit more of a shift towards left-leaning, the Greens, Teals, other minor parties in that kind of left spectrum. So there is a little bit of a gender gap there that's starting to become more prominent. But certainly, young people today are far less likely to vote for the two major parties than they were 20 years ago or even 10 years ago.
In connection with that, look, how do young people or young Australian perceive the trustworthiness and effectiveness of political leaders and its institution?
Look, it's always a moving issue. If you look, more broadly, generally the trust and the kind of belief in the democratic system in Australia is generally pretty high compared to other nations around the world. Significantly more, higher than perhaps the UK or the US, for example. But it's not trending in the right direction. Young people are feeling quite disconnected and disengaged from politicians. Often the research suggests that, young people view politicians as, in it for themselves, perhaps, bought and paid for by, corporations or special interest groups. And they don't really, find that they're trustworthy or, able to support or provide for their needs. So there is a disconnect there. But, overall, when you look at Australians, they still certainly favour the democratic system over any other system of government. Compared to internationally, the trust in government is probably higher than most other nations, but there is certainly some unsteadiness there that we really need to address.
That's interesting. Very interesting concept. All right, let's go back on the strategies. What strategies could be implemented to encourage more running for a political office?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the biggest ones is, providing people with the opportunity, young people with the opportunity to actually be an endorsed candidate. When young people get engaged with the political party, they spend a lot of time as a party volunteer or working for, an MP's office. And it takes a long time for them to kind of work through the ranks of that political party before they're provided the opportunity to, run for political office, which means that, in Australia at the moment, only 3% of state, local, and federal politicians are under the age of 30, or were under the age of 30 when they were elected. So, a really small number of young people are given the opportunity and the backing of their political party to run for political office. So, by providing young people more of an opportunity to be an endorsed candidate, that would certainly allow for more young people to be successful. It is very hard to get elected to office in Australia as a young independent candidate for office. So, that party backing is still a significant feature of the political system. So, we'd certainly want to get more young people as endorsed candidates within the political parties. And the ancillary benefit of that, of having more young, visible candidates running for office, is that young people within the community will feel more likely or more able to engage within the political process. Some of the research that I've been doing, particularly at the local level, has found that if a young candidate is successfully elected to office, there is often a significant increase in the number of other young candidates running at the next election in that electorate. So by having a visible role model in office, we can really promote the engagement of other young people within the community. And finally, coming back to that barrier of money, perhaps, by perhaps providing some institutional funds for young people running for office, whether that's an NGO or governmental funds, perhaps for independent candidates, would certainly help. And also, readjusting or reworking the remuneration of local councillors would particularly be very impactful because of that, that lack of remuneration at the local level means that, young people really can't be local councillors. They can't afford to do it. So by making it a professional office, by giving them a salary that is commensurate with the work that they do rather than, a really small stipend, that would encourage more young people to think or view this as a viable option for them or a viable career.
Thank you for that. How does the political engagement of young Australian compare to that of their counterpart in the other countries with compulsory voting system? We have
Yeah, so the compulsory voting system certainly means that young people are more engaged. They're more likely to be engaged simply because they're forced to be. There is a compulsion there. So, one of the benefits of the compulsory voting system is that, if you're encouraged or, if it is necessary for you to turn up and vote, generally, you will educate yourself to some degree about who the candidates are, what their policies might be, how that might impact or affect your life. So generally, by having a compulsory voting system, we're not just, forcing people to get out there and vote, but we're also generally, helping them to become more politically literate or politically engaged. If you look overseas at some of the voluntary voting systems, the engagement of young people, is significantly lower than what it is in Australia. But that's only within formal politics. If you look at, a broader conceptualization of politics, young people internationally and in Australia are very, very concerned about political issues. But there is a disconnect between them and the formal political system of, voting, joining a political party, or running for political office. So, Australia is kind of insulated from some of those deeper ongoing issues because of our, vote compulsory voting system. But certainly there is, a disconnect there that needs to be addressed.
Thank you for that. What is the influence do global movement and international political events have on the political activism of young Australian?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a currently a thread within political science or an area of research which is called translocalism. So this idea that we take global political issues and act upon them within our own communities. That is a really significant way for young people to engage in politics, especially these days. So as we were talking before about the influence of social media, young people are highly engaged in these global political issues, whether it's wealth inequalities or ongoing conflicts in Gaza and Israel, climate change movements. Young people are very much engaged in these political issues that are global, but they very much localize them within their own community. So, a significant way that young people connect with political issues these days is, within their social network, within their families, with friends at school, within their university kind of cohort. So they engage, they take these big political issues like Black Lives Matter or something similar to that, and act upon them within their own community. So certainly it is becoming far more prevalent for young people to be engaged with larger political issues on a global scale.
Thank you for that. So we go back to the traditional media. What role does traditional media play in informing and influencing the political perspective of young Australian?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. Traditional, young people these days really don't consume that much traditional media. So until traditional media starts to meet and engage with young people on the platforms and with the systems that they actually use, it's not going to have as much of an influence as it did, for prior generations. But certainly, traditional media plays an important role in filtering and kind of setting the guardrails of discourse around political issues, of informing people about truth and fact, of engaging people in political issues. So they certainly still set the discourse or set some of the narratives around political issues. And you'll certainly see if there's a news story in a traditional media source, generally podcasters, social media influencers, and other people will start to engage with that issue as well. So traditional media still plays an important role in that kind of sense. But certainly, they need to either start to meet young people where they're at through these, means and platforms that young people use, or they need to rethink the ways in which they go about, presenting news to draw more young people in. But certainly, because of their editorial standards, certainly they help to frame the discourse in beneficial ways for the deliberative process.
Thank you so much for that. My last question for you, Luke, is that looking ahead, what are your say prediction for the evolution of youth political engagement in Australia over say next decade?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I would certainly hope that over the next decade, young people would be more politically active in the formal political setting. So, certainly, I would hope that young people are going to be running for office more, being more engaged within parliaments and local councils. That would certainly be something that I would hope for. Going forward in terms of, the ideological split where, we're at this point in time in politics where everything is in flux. You can see that with the rise of Donald Trump. You can see that with the rise of some of the more far left wing socialist, social democratic kind of movements around people like Bernie Sanders or overseas internationally. So some of these more kind of fringe political beliefs have become a little bit more mainstreamed because the democratic system itself, or the politics as always, hasn't really been addressing the issues that are impacting people's lives, and because the democratic system has these flaws and hasn't been addressing particularly young people's issues of concern. That means that these voters or these young people will move to more kind of extreme ends of either side of the spectrum, or start to think about more radical ways in which to enact changes to society, to hopefully make society better. So my my view over the next 10 years is that Australian young people in Australia will certainly, continue to probably move away from the two-party system, unless there's drastic reform to the ways in which they engage with young people themselves. So, minor parties will start to play a more significant role, and I think we'll start to have, more, kind of difficult conversations around issues that, have been, unaddressed for the last couple of decades, particularly around issues like climate change, growing wealth inequality, housing, the casualization of the workforce, etc. So, we're going to have these deep conversations around these really important political issues, and the challenge that faces particularly government in Australia, but the major political parties and politicians, is being able to respond to that in a meaningful way. We can't keep on looking at politics as business as usual. We can't keep on seeing, giving tokenistic kind of policies to address these kind of core issues. We need to get our hands dirty and actually start acting upon these things. So that's certainly an issue going forward, and I'd certainly hope that all government and major political parties, etc., will start to take these critiques on board, because otherwise we'll start to follow some of the more more extreme kind of trends that we see in countries overseas, perhaps.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much, Luke Dean, an associate lecturer at Monash University. Thank you for your time.
No worries, Miko. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you, mate.
Thank you so much. That's another episode of the expert interview. See you again next week or another episode. Or we're doing. Hopefully, we can continue doing the live show because it's election time. So thank you so much for that, and see you again for another episode. Thank you.